Right. Good afternoon. And this area we're going to talk about is definitely an area which is growing in its importance and is very significant over the next period of the River Basin Management Plan, not just in Ireland, but across the whole of the EU. So whilst we probably don't recognise it, but Irish rivers are fairly heavily fragmented through weirs and dams, sluices and culverts and bridges. And this leads to barriers to fish migration and also habitat loss and damage. So we have a range of high-profile fish barrier mitigation programs and projects, such as down on the Shannon at Partine and Ardnacrusha. But also we have 73,000 small barriers on local watercourses, which are also causing difficulties for fish migration. So I'm very pleased to introduce Brian Coghlan from Inland Fisheries. He has 15 years experience at working with IFI and has been involved in the fisheries program, migration program, as a research officer, and previously been involved in the environmental EREPS program with OPW, looking at improving the dynamics and restoration of rivers across Ireland. So I'm very pleased to have Brian giving the talk today, and hopefully we'll be joined by Adam Fryer from Fishtek once we solve those technical problems. So I'll hand over to Brian now. That'll be great for giving your overview of where we are on fish passage and migration.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen here. Can we see this? Are we good? Okay, my name is Brian. My name is Brian Coghlan. I am the research officer for the National Barriers Programme. I'd just like to thank my team, which is Dr. Ciara O'Leary, Sarah Keane, and Roisin Donovan, who without this, support the programme and make the whole thing possible, really. So it's not just fish passage and the directives, as Jonathan alluded to there. It's the whole river health, really, in terms of continuity, in terms of upstream, downstream migration of not just fish but sediment, other wildlife, other animals, how the water travels through the system, and that water has historically always supported mankind in terms of how it used the landscape. But over that time, we've also been modifying the rivers to suit our own needs, and we may have reached a tipping point where we've modified the system so much that maybe they can't support the fish that some people rely on, or the habitat or the functionality that we always expected the rivers to give us. Maybe it's a capacity to deliver that. It's been reduced over time. So it's not just the fish passes in the directive. It's really looking at the whole river basin as a whole, these river basins as a whole. So, freshwater habitats are in significant trouble. And I like this little circular diagram here, because it outlines all the different pressures that these fish in our river systems are suffering from in terms of climate change, in terms of pollution, in terms of loss of habitat, in terms of wetland, and the rivers themselves. And a lot of our rivers have been canalized and straightened, and a lot of the functionality has been taken out of them. They've been reduced to very much just a water transportation thing. We have the dams, and we have overfishing in a lot of places. And to say, I like the quote, why does it matter? Because in a lot of cases, the fish and the fish population and the habitat's health will be directly linked to people's health and well-being and their capacity to, use the environment. And then, in my in the job I do in terms of fish passage, I think the diagram here on the right, the little cartoon, sort of a river runs through it, but maybe a lot of the cases the fish can't, or the sediment can't, or the processes that rivers should do are interrupted. So they can't support the fish community. So a river runs through it, but maybe the fish can't, and the other species can't utilize the river properly. So we need to address this. So I'm going to nail my colours to the mast straight off and say, free rivers work better. So historically, we may have utilized hydropower and water power, going forward, but now a lot of those systems and a lot of those those things in the rivers maybe sort of like they're obsolete, and maybe we should start thinking about like who trumps what in terms of maybe our historic building value or our natural environment. And we can have a really good conversation about that going forward, about our built heritage versus our natural heritage, and how do we align these two things, because you can't have a river that's significantly impacted by a whole load of weirs of historic nature and expect to have a thriving anadromous or migratory fish population in that river. Those two things may not be compatible. So, outline of my talk: the barrier effects, the fish species, drivers for change, barrier types, assessment in Ireland, mitigation strategies, and into the future. So, what does a weir do? Or a barrier do in a river? This is a nice sort of a diagram that sort of simply lays it out. The bottom one there is a dammed river. Top one there is a natural river. A natural river, everything just flows naturally downhill. Sediment is transported. The river form and function is supported by that sediment, and everything is slowly moving its way to the sea or into a lake environment. And those habitats, they support like spawning for fish. They support a natural temperature regime and the free passage of aquatic organisms upstream and downstream. Now, we're not going to talk about lateral connectivity here in terms of out onto the floodplain, but a natural dynamic river will facilitate all this. So what happens when you get a dammed river? Well, in reality, you've got a river that's been turned into a lake, and all those implications in terms of habitat and the species that can live there, and the sort of like the riparian corridor and all this stuff. So if you build a dam, you can create sedimentation. You create a uniform flow. So if you turn a river into a lake, in a lot of cases, so there'd be big impoundment. That's stagnant water. You get different vegetational types, get different fish species living there. You can alter the temperature regime. So think of a big, large, impounded area of shallow water that can heat up significantly over the summer. That in itself can make it inhabitable for some of our cold water northern European species like salmon and trout. Maybe they can't live in that habitat because the water is so warm. And passage is only a minor thing when you think about that. The fish have to get over this structure to get upstream to use the habitat upstream for maybe they want to spawn. But if they can't make it over the weir because the water temperature coming over the weir is so great, it could actually be not just a barrier in terms of physical barrier, but a temperature barrier as well. And all this needs to be couched in an idea that these dams and these weirs, some of them do provide a public benefit. So we have to think about that in terms of how we manage these structures, and they also can be a hazard. I can think of a good number of structures in and around the Greater Dublin area, nationally as well, where these structures have been built 150 years and very little money has been spent on maintenance. So who owns them? Is it acceptable just to have them fall down, or do we want to have a managed retreat from these structures? So I'll just go into, most people understand why fish, they need to move, they migrate through systems. So like a good example here is Atlantic salmon, who as adults, they go to sea to feed. They come back to their freshwater, their natal home, their native, they return natally home to their original river. So they always go back to the river, or most of the time they go back to the river they were spawned in. They dig a nest in the riverbed, in the riffles, called a red. That red is made up of loose cobble or gravel, and that's where the sediment comes in. If you have a weir or a dam collecting that sediment upstream, it's not moving down through the system, and maybe these fish don't have anywhere to spawn. They spawn in the gravels in the red. Fry alvins come out fry. They grow larger with par. They smoltify, which is they go turn silver, and they migrate back out to sea, where they can spend 2 to 3 years at sea, feeding up and returning as adults. So that's just an example of the Atlantic salmon. We also have sea trout, sea and river lamprey, which people are less familiar with. So sea lamprey and river lamprey, they're not even really fish. They're cartilaginous, so they're more closely related to sharks. They don't actually have they're not even true fish because they don't actually have a gills. Or no, sorry, they don't have a jaw. They have a sort of this oral sucking disc here. And they use that as adults to parasitize fish. So in terms of their life cycle, it's very similar to adults, but they don't, or they're very similar to Atlantic salmon, but they So they go to the sea, they spawn in shallow gravel riffle areas. They have these larval amicetes, which will hatch out of the red where they've been nested, and they'll float, and they live in muddy systems, or mud at the side of the river in these muddy habitats for 4 to 5 years. They're little worm-like larvae. And as they grow, after about 5 years, they grow to about 18, 19 centimeters. They transform into their adult phase, and they go on to parasitize fish, and the life cycle goes around again. So they're an example of it, and they're protected. They've got their SAC and habitat directed species, sea lamprey and adult lamprey. We have European eel as well. They go to their Sargasso Sea. So as I'm just trying to emphasize that the need of these fish to make these extensive migrations, and how structures in rivers can create a physical barrier to these migrations that need to happen. So it's not just migratory fish that need to move. If you take an example of a brown trout, Ireland have a number of different types of brown trout, and they all have slightly different life stages and life histories and how they utilize their habitat. So a juvenile trout, he's not going to live in the one place the whole time. He might want to migrate upstream. If this juvenile trout was born, let's say, somewhere in the lower shore, he might migrate all the way upstream to Temple Moor. So he might migrate up there to live, and he might come back down again. So they have different life stages. They use the habitat differently. So they'll have nursery habitat and feeding habitat, and you have spawning migrations and feeding migrations. So these fish are sort of evolved to use the whole river habitat. So, barriers in the river will break up their capacity to utilize this habitat and may affect their life strategies. So implications for barrier fish, I'm going to talk about the purple ones separately, but they're upstream and downstream barriers. As I said, like these animals, like an Atlantic salmon, he'll spawn in fresh water, and his juvenile and his offspring will go to sea to feed up, to get larger, to return as adults to spawn. So they have to go downstream as well as returning upstream. So implications of barriers for fish, they may not be able to get where they need to go. A lot of the best habitat we have is in the headwater streams of our larger rivers. If you have numerous structures going up to that, can they even get there? In cases, you have numbers of weirs in sequence. Physical damage is an example down here of it's an adult Atlantic salmon who's damaged himself traversing a weir. So he's got a fungal infection now because he was trying to pass a barrier. You got exposure to predators and poachers, low flow, high temperatures in cases where you've got abstraction going on, and large impoundments where the water temperature can become hostile to these cold water fish. Got loss of energy and condition where they're waiting around potentially weeks and weeks on end for a high water flow so they can pass these structures. And then that has a problem with that in terms of loss of milt and eggs, in terms of when they get to spawn, maybe they're not physically capable of producing as many eggs and spawn as they could have. So that has a negative impact on the species as a whole in these rivers. So example of exposure to predators. This is from America. You can see upstream there's pelicans eating the juvenile fish coming down, adult pelicans eating the adults coming up. So as you can see here, this is a real predator bottleneck for these. That's the shad migration in America. We also have situations like that in Ireland. I'm just saying, there's an angler, he's at the Galway Weir, and that in itself slows down the migration of adult salmon. So, and he's taking advantage of that, just saying, I'm up for the fish. And then you have a compound effects of structures, one barrier after another, and how that can affect the fish migration. This example is from down in Wexford. Adult sea trout returning from sea. This is the first structure they meet, kilometer upstream, another kilometer, another kilometer, another kilometer, another kilometer, another kilometer. So multiple structures in a row, each one taking time and energy to pass, each one delaying them when they want trying to get to the habitat they're trying to get to. And again, their offspring will have to return to sea, back down over all these structures again. And this migration could be hindered. So some of the drivers for change, excuse me, we have the Water Frameworks Directive that states specifically The continuity of the river is not disturbed, so there's a free flowing of sediment downstream and fish passage upstream. The Habitats Directive, which states that, to maintain and restore the natural habitats and the population species. And under those, we have the salmon, shad, and lamprey. And we have the eel regulation, which again, those fish need to get to where they need to go with as least human impact as possible. And more recently, we have the EU Biodiversity Strategy for 2030, bringing nature back into our lives, where it says over the greater European area, 25,000 kilometers of rivers will be stored for free flowing state by 2030. So that breaks down to about 1,000 kilometers in Irish rivers. So we're going to have to look into how we're going to make our targets there in terms of either barrier removal, mitigation. What can we do to attain that? So we have different types of structures in our rivers. So we have natural structures like waterfalls, rapids, and they're very important because they maintain a genetic integrity and biosecurity. So in certain circumstances, you'll have very unique populations of fish upstream of the waterfall because no one else can get up there to breed with them. So you've got a genetically distinct populations. And biosecurity, where maybe it'll be these structures are keeping invasive species out. We've got artificial and man-made structures. And what we've done is we've collated them down into these 5 different categories: dam, culvert, which is a bridge as well. So anything spanning a river, weirs, fords, and sluices. So down the bottom right there, you've got a weir and then a sluice on the Shannon. Someone trying to stick their head in it. So to understand the barrier effect, you must think like a fish and understand their limitations. So historically, everyone was very interested in Atlantic salmon, and they still are. And that's fair enough. But we have to think of everyone who's in the river, all these migratory fish and these fish that need to move to fulfill their life strategies. And we need to understand their limitations. So, Atlantic salmon are amazing jumpers, recorded jumping more than 3 meters in height in terms of big waterfalls in Scotland. But that's not your average salmon. So your average summer salmon, a weir that's 0.6 of a meter is going to start to be a problem for it in terms of jumping over it. And by 1.4 meters, it's going to be a complete barrier. So that's for salmon. And they're the best species we have for getting over man-made structures in rivers. What about everybody else in terms of sea lamprey, in terms of shad, bream, and eel? Well, for these guys who don't jump and aren't capable of swimming very well, sort of like a structure in a river may start to become a barrier for juvenile lamprey when it's greater than 0.1. So when it's this big, it's starting to impact on the fish's capacity to make passage on that structure. Same with the depth of water. If you're a 10-pound adult salmon and there's only this much water traveling over the top of the weir, you won't be able to swim over it because you'll swim onto it and fall over and get washed off. So we need to think about how these structures are affecting the passage of these different fish and not just Atlantic salmon. So we have dams, which we thankfully don't have very many in the country. Use generation electricity and water supply. You got Partine and you got the Vartry Reservoir as an example. You've got culverts, basically stream crossings, river crossings. We're lucky we have a lot of those older historic bridges, which were built very well, like high arches, very wide, multiple eyes. Rivers change over time though. So this bridge down here in the video, I'm sure it wasn't built originally with this big drop off the bridge floor. I'd say the river has probably changed over time. The example from the US Forestry Service, rivers change over time. So it's important to get it right when you're putting it in the first time and maybe spending the money to get it right at the first time so you don't have to come back to it. Some more examples of culvert. This is an example of down the bottom right here. You can see the fish getting blown off the culvert, and that's an example of how these structures affect fish passage. I mean, the water is just flowing too fast and it's too shallow, and you just can't make passage. And the others two just don't, they're just overly sized, perched, really poor in terms of providing passage for fish. We've got weirs, which are aimed at regulating flow conditions. Example here is the top right. You got on the Barrow catchment. Bottom left here is another example, and then you got the one in Athlone. Here's an example here. That's the fish past that little bit in the middle, and the baffles are broken in it, so it's not really functioning anymore. So Anyway, so we've got more weirs, forwards as well. Again, are an issue as the water's coming through the pipes. Fish don't like swimming up through pipes. It's very fast and it's hard for them to make passage. It's not natural. But sluices as well, some on the Shannon, knocking around Waterways Ireland. These are for opening and closing, regulating water levels. So when does it become a fish? As I said before. So in terms of what we're looking at here is a bridge culvert. In the middle here, this is designed as a fish pass. This concrete aprony bit that was put down along the apron is concrete. I don't know how would you describe it, a raised lip. And the idea was that it was going to attract the fish into this central section. Well, it's all well and good, but the water's only still less than 0.1 of a centimeter, 0.1 of a meter. So that's going to be very problematic for fish to swim through. There's an upstream and downstream view. So maybe adult salmon maybe make it, but the rest of them, not a chance. Here's an example of a fish ladder. And really if you look at your fish ladders and your fish passes around and go to a weir anywhere in the country, we were lucky we have many of them in terms of the fish pass, not the weir. They have been designed for adult salmon. And so you'll probably make passage with an adult salmon on this. He'll probably make passage up through this fish pass. But the rest of the species in the group, like the juvenile Atlantic salmon, lamprey, the cyprinids, the coarse fish, and the eels, there's too much velocity, it's too high, the turbulence going through the structure. It's going to be problematic for making passage for them. And this is where we come in. We got to make these, intuitive design calls where everyone has to be involved, not just the Atlantic salmon. So there's your problems, potential solutions. Most of the problems that we'll find in Ireland in terms of barriers to fish passage, I'd say 95% of them will be culverts. The weirs, we have approximately 3,000 of them in the country, yet we have, I don't know, it's 68,000 culverts. So this is where the real problems are. This is the death by 1,000 cuts by all these small culverts impacting on fish passage throughout the country. Some of the solutions here offered by the Americans looks like a historic clear span bridge, and they've shown that if you invest in the front at the start with a clear span structure, you will have to spend less money maintaining them over time. Woody debris flows through them. Big floods don't break them. There's less likely to be scouring downstream, and they're more sustainable in the long run. You have to spend less money. Even though you're spending more money up front, you're spending less money overall. And it's called the stream simulation. So you can see here. And yeah, we're doing it in Ireland as well. There's a bridge in Wicklow, spanning the river, lots of head height for woody debris to go through. It can't be blocked. And the river natural low flow channel is supported in the middle of the structure. Some practical solutions. We have these guidance documents. The OPW guidance docs for fish passage on small barriers is very good. That's usually dealing with culverts and small weirs in the stream. If you don't want to remove them, how to step them out using sort of a rock ramp fish pass. Guidance from IFI, working around water, and then the stream simulation approach in the Americas, which is about spanning your river. So this is an example of work that we did in IFI last year, the Ballinaccarrig Weir on the Burn River. It's a tributary of the Barrow. As you can see here, it's about 1.6 meters in height. There's our man here standing on top of it. So it's quite a big weir. Fish pass, designed for Atlantic salmon, really not very good. Poor attraction flow, high velocity, lots of turbulence in there. You wouldn't be building that like that now. So another couple of view downstream of the weir. I mean, it was a historic poaching hotspot for Atlantic salmon. That's because they all got stuck there. So what have we done? You can see here what IFI has done. We've created a rock ramp fish pass. Excuse me. So we created a rock ramp fish pass where we've lowered the head height of the weir. We couldn't remove the weir because there was a bridge just upstream and we don't want to damage the footing. So what they did is they reduced the height of the weir and created these series of sort of stepped weirs downstream of the structure. And as you can see here, there's gaps between these large boulders. So there's the head height, the drop between each water level is not very high, and the velocity isn't hugely great between those between those gaps. So what we've done is we created like a long stepped out structure where the head height has been basically progressed downstream over a long section. They've hardened the banks to make sure it doesn't get washed out. And at this stage now, we've gone from a structure where there's, it was a high impact structure even for Atlantic salmon in terms of they're making fish passage. Now they'll just tip on up through that. And even the poor swimming fish species such as juvenile lamprey and coarse fish will easily make passage up that as they go from one pool to another. And actually, when we were there surveying, you can see that there was trout utilizing the pools as habitat between the different stepped structures. And we got some salmon spawning downstream as well, because while you're at it, you might as well put in a whole load of spawning gravel. So as you can see here, the steps as they come out with the gaps between each of the steps. So just a little talk about my barrier program. So we were paid for the Department of Housing to deliver an inventory of barrier structures in Irish rivers, supported by applied studies, looking at best practice for barrier mitigation, getting our bang for our bucks in terms of where we're going to do it, what we're going to do, and sort of opening up the most amount of optimal habitat as possible for migratory fish. So a lot of the time I just provide the documentations for funding proposals for mitigation work. So I'll go in there and I'll do the pre-survey in terms of barrier assessment in terms of fish passage. I write up a document, supply that to the sort of the operations team, and they'll go on to mitigate the structure. And I'll go back in and do post works as well. And we're hoping to coordinate with government agencies in terms of, let's say, sort of county councils in terms of they have ownership of a lot of bridges. Some of those might be in disrepair in terms of their bridge floor. There might be a barrier to fish passage, and it would be really great if IFI can sort of start working in tandem with the county councils in terms of mitigating their barriers to fish passage. And there's funding available and coming up online as well. Is coming online next year, I think, for that sort of dual partnership in terms of assessing structures and then mitigating them. So where are we to date in terms of barrier assessment? We've assessed approximately 30,000 structures in the island of Ireland. And how many have we got? We've got about 8,000, got about 5,500 barriers to fish passage identified. We reckon in the whole of the country, we've got about 10,000 barriers to fish passage. We have 73,000 potential barriers, and we're calling them potential barriers because we haven't identified them. We haven't looked at them yet. So, and we haven't been able to figure out a way to model them. Are they a barrier or not? I think on-site assessment is the only way to go with this. And we have an open data portal if you're interested. If you go Inland Fisheries Ireland open data portal and type in the National Barriers Programme data set, you can click around with the data, and it's really useful. So if you have any sort of have a look at the data, and then you can even email Inland Fisheries, and then we can get back to you. So into the future, the new barriers mitigation program is coming online next year. So these are the people who are going to be mitigating these structures. They're going to be looking at culverts, and they're going to be looking at weirs, and they're going to be looking at, say, where can we spend our money and where can we open up as much free-flowing river as we can. And they hope to do 270 barrier mitigation programs in about a 5-year cycle. And it's going to be part of the catchment management plans led by LawPro. So the minimum investment is 50 million. Okay, so there's going to be a lot of money to mitigate these structures, and hopefully with this program we'll see a sort of the opening up of a lot of river channel, which has been not as that wasn't really as available for spawning migratory fish as historic as it should be. You know what I mean? So, and as Jonathan said earlier, he said some of the pilot projects we're looking at Ardnacrusha, the Lower Downer Fish Passage, Anacotti Weir, which is down on the Mulcair. If you're interested in some of this fish passage stuff, you should type in Anacotti Weir into Google or even into YouTube, and there's information there about the mitigation that's going on, and the Dlahaman Weir and tail race down on the Slaney. So that's it. That's me. A river runs through it, but we can't. So we were hoping that the first lesson in sort of mitigation, making things better, is don't make it any worse. So if we can prevent sort of more culverts going in and having better fish sort of, if you're putting in a river crossing that it has a fish friendly outcome, that's the win. Okay. So thank you very much. Any questions?
That's excellent, Brian. Sets the scene.
Yeah. So we're really hoping to be open for business in terms of, you know, people looking at structures in rivers and saying, you know, well, that might be a problem and maybe we should address it and maybe we should talk to inland fisheries and we can add some guidance to it.
So I could see there's some citizen science potential there for your open data portal. I don't know whether that's something you'd encourage.
Yes, I think so. The citizen science really is a gateway to, you know, people coming on board and maybe change for IFI to maybe change people's, you know, the way they look at some of these structures, because like people love their weirs, people love their landscape, and weirs are an inherent part of the river landscape in a lot of places. So when IFI comes along and says, well, that's a buried fish passage and we'd like to mitigate or even remove it, and removal would be our first option, people can, you know, it's very emotive. So getting the message out there that these fish species need to, you know, to migrate freely is really important.
Yeah, very good. Well, obviously, I live down on the River Shannon, very close to Partine, so I've got a big interest in in that project. Yeah. If just one final question before we introduce our next speaker, and we'll come back to more open questions at the end. The potential to integrate a fish passage or a fish pass with a wider restoration of a river system, is that something with this that you could get into with this partnership program that you've introduced there?
Yes, I think we'd have to look very hard at it because in terms of barrier removal, that in itself is river restoration. Because you've removed a very potentially quite a significant blockage for like both sediment and habitat and all those things. So a lot of the case, if you remove the weir or the barrier, like the river will return to a more natural setting very, very quickly. So it is river restoration as such. And in some of these really big structures, you might have 2 or 3 kilometers of impounded water upstream of the structure. Yeah. You take away the weir, you make it natural back where the weir was, and you've actually quite good gains in, you know, in restoration.
Great. Well, I just had a question in from Mark Murphy. Hi, Mark. So let me just read that properly. Well, there's some more here. So I find now reference the US Forestry Service river crossing guidelines as part of its response to EIA scoping inquiries.
No.
That's no is the answer to that one.
I'm just going to be. This is probably where we would like to be, in terms of like providing. I know like how would you put it? Replacing culverts with something more, you know, sort of fish friendly.
Okay, sorry, that was from Justin Lowen. Mark Murphy. So I know Mark, so that's why I went down there. What's the greatest barrier, pardon the pun, for IFI to remove the barriers? So what is the thing that you struggle with in terms of getting out there and doing it?
I think it's changing people's perception in terms of that, you know, citizen science, that, you know, in cultural engagement about what rivers are supposed to do. Because we've always, you know, there's a line someone said, like, you know, we've always had historically a command and control idea of rivers, where you confine them and you engineer them and you do these things, and weirs are part of that. And to step away from that a little bit and say, well, the river is the river, and the river does river things, and giving it back that capacity to do that, and that'll have a positive benefit for, you know, all the habitat and the species that are in the river.
Okay. I see there's a few more questions, but before we go down that route of just having more of a conversation about this area, which is fascinating, can I introduce, well, not my doppelganger, let's just make that clear now, that we solved our technical problems by Toby Coe stepping in for Adam Fryer from Fishtek, but he's just using my login at the moment. So I'll introduce Toby in a minute. He wants to put his camera on. Excellent. And appreciate Toby dealing with this on a Monday. So Fishtek have had fantastic success in looking at fish passage removal and improvements. across the UK and internationally. And so Adam's going to just take us through some of the lessons that's been learned along that way. Fishtek are part of the RSK group, which includes Nicholas Dwyer, Jennings O'Donovan, and Seebeck, so that you can see how the engineering and the river restoration and the fisheries management is now coming together inside RSK. So, Toby, I think no further ado, I'll let you take us through your lessons learned from doing a lot of restoration work and fish passage.
Thank you, Jonathan. Many apologies, everyone, as well, for the slight errors at our end. Not quite sure what's happened here. We think there may be a mix-up with dates. Anyway, I'm stepping in for Adam. Let me share my screen.
That's perfect.
Perfect. Great. Okay. So if I'll do a quick introduction first as to who I am and my background. I'm the MD at Fishtek. My background is fisheries biology. I'm not an engineer. I'm a fisheries biologist by training. I've been at Fishtek now full-time for about 13 years. As a company, we specialize in fish passes and eel passes and their design. And in the case of small eel passes and fish passes, their fabrication and installation. I've worked across the whole of the UK and a little bit in Ireland, but also internationally quite extensively over the years, with a focus on the Mekong Basin, which is a fascinating watercourse to work on. And it's currently an area of the world where there's a huge focus on hydropower, and there's a lot of hydropower schemes being built. So we've provided specialist advice to several dams on how to mitigate or reduce the impact of a proposed dam on fisheries. So the topic is, it was actually, the title is, the title of it, the talk hasn't changed. It was an idea I gave to Adam. I'm afraid the presentation is quite internationally focused because it's a presentation I've changed and updated slightly for today. But really it's a look at where the trends of fish pass design are going, but more on the challenges and opportunities of fish pass design. And the focus of this is are areas that I and my colleagues have seen come up again and again and again, both on large projects and small projects, and particularly the failures of fish pass design. And what I should say is that when I'm talking about fish pass design here, I'm not bypassing barrier removal, because as Brian has obviously touched on, barrier removal is always and always will be the best option for mitigating any barrier. A fish pass is always going to be a second best option. But I'm not going to touch on barrier removal. This is just on fish passes. So at hydropower schemes, and often actually at any barrier that's been in place for a long time, there are two environmental issues that often stand out, and they are basically fish and sediments. Those are the two common themes that I've encountered in my career cropping up most often. And in talking about a new project or a new scheme, the issues that are typically considered at early project stages may miss some of the key threats to fish. And I'll touch on this more directly as we come forward, but often it's because when we're considering fish and the impacts of a barrier on fish, people often think of fish passage as being upstream. So fish going upstream, which is where fish passes come in. But fish passage by definition is bidirectional. Most fish that migrate upstream, or probably all fish that migrate upstream, have a life stage that comes back downstream at a later date. And there's been a real change I've seen in the last decade where this consideration of bidirectionality of fish passage has really come to the fore. And we've observed these similarities across multiple schemes that vary hugely in size, their geography, and also their morphology. And we've observed the same shortcomings that are often made at early project stages in many different projects. So in terms of fish passage, upstream fish passage is always a thing that anyone thinks of first, in my experience, when they're considering the impact of a hydropower scheme or a barrier that's in a river. And there is a huge amount of research and literature on the topic. And as a result, many hydropower schemes or any mitigation for a barrier will typically be looking at a fish pass. Excuse me. There's two examples here. The fish pass that you can see on the left is a vertical slot fish pass in France. This is a really common type of fish pass on the continent. It's not so common certainly in the UK. I think there are a few in Ireland. And on the image on the top right is a large spillway in Liberia, actually. And one of the common considerations is, well, we're going to put a dam across the river, or we have an existing dam across the river. Where do we put our fish paths, or what kind of fish paths do we build? And what we often see are some major failings that come up again and again. So for those of you who aren't familiar with fish passes, I put a few more examples up on the screen now. Hopefully you can all see the numbers. There's 1 to 5 here. These are fish passes that we've designed that have been built in the last few years. So on the top left is a large rock ramp bypass channel fish pass. This is on the River Severn. This was part of the large Unlocking the Severn project for shad. I was really pleased with this fish pass and how it turned out. So we knew at this site we wanted a bypass channel. It's particularly difficult to design a bypass channel of this scale for shad, because shad need a minimum depth of water to migrate of around 18 inches, which doesn't sound very much. But as soon as you start to get depths that high, and you need to have velocities or slopes, that are reasonably high, so over 1%, you get really, really high velocities in your fish pass, unless you have essentially vertical roughness elements to reduce that velocity. And what that typically is, what is typically used to do that are rocks. Now, the issue with rocks is they're quite difficult to get in set shapes. Obviously, if you can cut them to create a set shape, but that doesn't really make a lot of sense. So what we ended up doing was coming up with these precast concrete boulders, if you like. And when we did design originally, we went to France and we saw some really good rock ramps, and they had round boulders in them. And we started the design with round boulders. And then we went to Portugal and we saw some rock ramps that had square and rectangular boulders. And it immediately struck me that as soon as you had a square boulder, you created these really nice areas, admittedly quite small, behind the boulders of still water. And you essentially had the whole structure with a whole series of resting pools all the way up it behind the boulders, that you don't get when you get round boulders, where the flow adheres to the boulder, comes round it, and you get a very small V of slow water behind it. So we took the learnings from Portugal, applied it to Severn, and we ended up with this structure here in image 1, and it works really well for shad, and also for salmon, and also for sea lamprey. So we've had some really good, up to 100% efficiency passage rates for both sea lamprey and Alice shad, they're actually Thwaite Alice shad hybrids on this fish pass. The second fish pass on the slide is the vertical slot pass at the bottom of the Severn at Diglis. It's part of the large Unlocking the Severn project. Again, very good passage efficiency rates, not quite as good, interestingly, as the first fish pass, but it is still very good. And interestingly, even though we have quite high head losses between the pools of 23 centimeters, we're getting really small coarse fish of less than 100 millimeters going up through this fish pass, we think, by exploiting small areas of low velocity at the slots, which are the areas where the water drops between each of the pools. Fish pass number 3 is a Lorinier fish pass. This has been almost the default within the UK for about the last 15 years or so. It's primarily aimed at salmonids, migratory salmonids, salmon and sea trout. I think there's more of an understanding that this is not a great option, as Brian kind of alluded to, for other fish species like migratory cyprinids. And I think what we're going to see is a move away from this type of fish pass when we're trying to consider a wider species population than just salmon and sea trout. And I think it will phase out slightly in favor of rock ramps, bypass channels, and vertical slots. And that certainly, in my opinion, is the way it should go when we want to have a much wider migration of fish species. That brings me on to image number 4 here on the far right. That is actually a fish pass. It's a natural bypass channel that we designed on the Thames. We designed it to be very low gradient. It has what's called a brush pass at the downstream end, but you can see there that it really does live by its name of a natural bypass channel. It has very natural channel features. It's actually ended up looking like a really nice section of river. Incidentally, when we were there, we saw lots of different aquatic invertebrates there. We saw several upwing species, including tree mayfly, and also there's evidence of water voles using this channel. So you get a double hit, if you like, here of fish passage and also a habitat gain. And image number 5 is an eel pass. So this is a pumped eel pass on a very complex sluice structure. We design an awful lot of eel passes across the whole of the UK, including gravity-fed pumped passes. and in some cases even whole retrofits of weir faces so that they're passable by eels. What we do see, though, on projects where we're brought in to provide some expert kind of judgment, is that the decisions that are often made on a project are often locked in quite early on, and fish passes that are included may be inappropriate. And we often see the same thing, and it's the entrance to the fish pass is in the wrong place and the size of the fish pass is incorrect. And I've got some really good examples of this. So these are two projects that I've looked at internationally. The top one is actually one where I provided an expert review. It's on the River Mekong. It's the Pakben hydropower scheme. And what you can see here on the far true right channel of the dam that's proposed, you've got a navigation lock. You then have a spillway, and on the true left side to the right side, as we're looking at the screen, you've got the powerhouse. And that blue line in the bank you can see is the fish pass. So the fish pass entrance is about 2 kilometers downstream of the dam. Now, it's a horrendous fish pass design as far as I'm concerned, because any fish that are coming upstream, if they miss that entrance to the fish pass, they'll end up at the dam or at the spillway. They have no a priori knowledge that there is a fish pass there or there's a route upstream there, because they've missed the entrance to it, and you will have low efficiency rates for that fish pass. The bottom right is Itaipu in the Amazon basin. So this is the largest fish pass in the world. You can see the dam on the far right, or the powerhouse on the far right of the image. The spillway is just to the left of it as we're looking at it. It's that kind of those three blue lines. The entrance to the fish pass is down here on the left of the image, on the true left-hand bank. It's something like 4 kilometers downstream of the dam. Now, it's kind of touted as being the world's largest fish pass. Actually, when you dig around into the literature for long enough, as I have done, the efficiency of that fish pass is about 7%. So roughly 7% of the fish that are trying to go upstream at that site don't or do manage it. And one of the reasons I believe is that A, it's too small, and B, the entrance is just in completely the wrong place. It's far too far from the dam, which is the primary barrier. So the main learning from this is if you want a fish pass to be efficient, the first thing you need to do is to put the entrance in the right place. So put the entrance at the point where fish are going to try and migrate to. And it sounds really obvious, but it's surprising how many times we see this problem coming up again and again. And the second problem is that fish passes are too small. Again, I've seen this quite commonly, more often on large international projects. But a good rule of thumb generally is that you want your fish pass in a small to medium river. The fish pass should take about, at Q95 flow, so the low summer flow, your fish pass should have within it about 10% of the average flow within the river. So if your average flow in the river is 10 QMEX, and your Q95 flow is 1.5 QMEX, your fish pass, when the flow in the river is 1.5 QMEX, should have about a QMEC in it. So at low summer flows, your fish pass should actually have most of the water in it. And then what happens is as the river gets higher and the flows increase, your fish pass flow proportionally decreases. What you shouldn't do is start by having, say, 10% of your Q95 flow in your fish pass, because by the time you get up to medium to high flows, when actually a lot of fish migration happens, you've got such a small proportion of flow in it that fish don't find the fish pass. So what you can see on the right-hand side of the image here is this 1% rule. And I see this as a sliding scale. So in small to medium flow rivers, it's about 10%. When you go up to really big rivers, and I'm talking here things like the Amazon, the Mekong, the Columbia in the States, these really big rivers, it moves to all about 1%. The main reason for that is that if you try to put 10% of the river flow in a fish pass on, say, the Mekong or the Columbia, the fish pass would become so massive, it just will become unaffordable. And you'd end up proposing a fish pass that the engineering team and the finance team push back on and say, there's no way we can build this. It's going to cost us more to build than it will the dam. And your advice essentially becomes slightly pointless because it can't be accepted. So what this actually manifests as is two fish passes there. So the fish pass that's on the left-hand side, the drone shot, is a Larinio fish pass on the River Team, which is a tributary to the River Severn. Q mean here was 12 cubic meters per second, and that fish pass is taking just under 1.2 cubic meters per second. So that 10% rule. The fish pass on the right is taking about 50 cubic meters per second. That's me standing inside the fish pass that we designed. That is roughly 1% of the Q mean, which is 5,000 cubic meters a second. It's the River Mekong. This is a giant river. This is incidentally quite a long way up the Mekong. Down at the delta in Vietnam, it's more like 12 to 13,000 cubic meters per second. So you can see that that kind of rule I said of going to 1% means that you still end up with an enormous structure because your flows are so high. But what it does mean is you end up with something that when the flow is higher, even though it's only taking 1% of the flow, it has a reasonable chance of fish finding the entrance. So another problem that we've come across, and it's something that crops up more with hydropower, although we have seen it with some other projects where water is being diverted, is that when you have a fish pass at a dam, that's great in that it mitigates the migration at the dam or the barrier. But the depleted reach, so the stretch of river that water is diverted around, that can actually become a barrier. So if you leave too little water in the depleted reach, and the depleted reach is typically the stretch of river between your dam at the top and where your turbine powerhouse is, that stretch of river will then become a dam, so a barrier in itself. So it doesn't matter how good the fish pass is at the dam, if fish can never migrate through that stretch of depleted reach, the fish pass is almost irrelevant. So this is two images from a river that we looked at in Nepal. So when we were there, the flow at this point was about 12 cubic meters per second. So we were there in essentially the dry season. So these rivers are highly snowmelt driven. So you get a huge flow through the snowmelt season for about 2 or 3 months, and then it slowly finds back. The proposal in this river, or the Nepalese guidelines, are that the flow can be reduced in your depleted reach to 10% of your minimum river flow. So that river channel, as you're looking at it there, which is roughly the wetted channel there is 20 to 30 meters wide, could, in theory, be left with 1 cubic meter per second in it, which would essentially mean that the whole river from bank to bank would end up being no more than 6 inches deep at the most. When you consider that some of the migratory species here are marcia that might weigh tens of pounds, that is clearly inadequate. And our advice on this project was that there had to be a significantly higher e-flows left within depleted reach in order for fish migration to be sustained into the future. So the solutions to this are to consider the basic principles of fish passage from the very start. So put your fish pass in your right place. And then the second aspect of fish pass design is that you need to convince fish that they are staying in the river. And the way I think about this is that it's really, really simple. If you're a fish migrating upstream, the only thing you're trying to do is to keep migrating upstream, assuming that you're at that point within your migration, and that you stay in the river. So a fish pass, all it does is essentially convince a fish that it's staying in the river. And if you imagine a fish pass that diverted all of the river through it, and the hydraulic conditions meant that fish could physically swim through it, that fish pass would be 100% efficient because there's nowhere else that fish can go. They have to swim up the fish pass to go upstream. And a fish pass, a good fish pass, just maintains that illusion, if you like, to fish that they are swimming upstream through the river. And then the third point, fairly obviously, is that you need to hydraulically engineer conditions within the fish pass so that fish can physically swim through the structure. And if you do those three things well, then your fish pass should work. So you can also use that water for fish passage, though, to resolve multiple problems. And what I mean here is that you can use your fish pass, if you're clever, as a downstream passage route as well. So downstream fish passage is often the poorer cousin, if you like, of upstream fish passage, or it has been historically. That is changing, and it's changing quite rapidly, and that's good. And I think there's some really good evidence coming from some of the smolt tagging work, for example, in Scotland, I'm aware of. I know there's some work being done in Ireland. I'm less familiar with it, I must admit, that has shown that smolt passage is, or the loss of smolts within river systems, is a really big problem. And by addressing this, we should hopefully address one of the primary mortality factors on our salmon populations. The problem is that downstream passage can often be quite difficult to accommodate if it's not done at the start of a project. So with a perspective or thinking about hydropower schemes, passage via turbines may not be possible or may have high mortality. Bypass routes may not be included, and this is often the case on barriers within rivers that are historical barriers, as well as on hydropower schemes. And where bypass routes are included, they need water, and they need that water to be available. And what I mean by this is that make sure you can get to that passage route. And I've seen this so many times. Brian put up a great slide earlier of a fish pass in the middle of a weir. As health and safety becomes more and more onerous and CDM regulations become more and more important, If you don't put your fish pass and your bypass route somewhere where you can get to it safely and you can maintain it, you might as well not build it in the first place, because I've seen so many fish passes in my time that are blocked with trees, traffic cones. Dead sheep are perfect in old Alaskan passes because they're wedged in there really firmly. Old tires, tractor tires are also ideal. If you can't get out to them and remove them, there's no point building them. So the solutions are, what are turbine mortality rates and the evidence? So that's obviously hydropower related. There's some really good work being done in the States to come up with fish-friendly turbines. There's if anyone's interested, drop me an email. There's a really good company working on some very impressive modeling work to improve turbines for retrofits, specifically retrofit for hydropower schemes. Make sure that if you have turbines that can't be, that the fish can't pass through safely, put in screening, or ideally try and combine your bywash with your fish pass. So have your fish pass in such a location that the upstream end of it is at a place where downstream migrating fish can easily find it and they can move down through the fish pass. So your fish pass is doing both things. It's a bi-directional route. So it's mimicking or utilizing or speaking to fish, if you like, and their bi-directionality of fish migration.